So it seems odds on that Warhammer 40K's next balance update should drop in the next month or so. Let's talk a bit about what Games Workshop might be most likely to change, and a few other things that could be really nice to add some more fun to Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about future balance updates, and rounding up a few more obvious things that Games Workshop might choose to address, both for factions that seem to be a bit overtuned or undertuned at the moment, or certain units and playstyles that seem to have fallen by the wayside a bit in their codexes. So far, Games Workshop haven't really given us any major clues as to the next balance update and when it comes out, but throughout 10th edition so far they've tended to have a pretty stable pattern, usually tending to work in roughly 3-month intervals, with the last one being mid-December, so it seems there's at least a reasonable chance that that would imply that the next balance update comes out mid-March. If I had to guess, I'd probably say it's likely to be either sort of mid-March or a bit later than that, maybe somewhere between mid-March to mid-April, just due to the previous one in December coming maybe a little bit unusually early, and it's perhaps not entirely clear whether Games Workshop is intending to sort of readjust the balance calendar and go for sort of December, March, June as their new one, or whether or not they're maintaining how they do things normally, and that one was sort of an unusually early update thanks to the Grotmus detachments. In any case, this one should be the last one of the Pariah Nexus updates, which was in early June 2024, and in around that time in summer 2025 we'd be expecting the last of their big season updates around then. If they're going with Pariah Nexus for this one, it seems kind of likely that the next mission pack might be one with Nachmund as the name on the cover to tie in with the Crusade book, similar to how they had a Crusade Pariah Nexus book dropping before their previous one. That would likely come out with a new mission deck, plus maybe some more big core changes to the game. And if they keep to the tried and tested 3-year edition cycle, that'll be the last one of 10th edition before the next one goes into 11th. In any case, a new one is in the not too distant future at the moment. They're usually roughly 3 monthly. We've had 2 months since the last one, so whether it's somewhere between March or April, we're not really miles out from the next in either way. Last time Games Workshop gave us quite a lot of very specific hints, saying that there'd be changes for Sisters, Marines, Deathwatch, Genestealer cults and more. I think they were quite so specific with that one because they'd probably realised the rules changes that they wanted to make for them, but they were choosing to hold off on them for the time being, as they were basically doing alternating points only updates and then big rules updates, as they'd said was their intentions from the start of 10th. Maybe the only major hint that we got in the last rules update though was that that would no longer be the format. Now they were just going to do rules updates and points updates whenever it made sense to in these 3 monthly balance passes, and not arbitrarily keep all the rules for the 2 big half-yearly passes. I feel like that does make some sense, perhaps in particular coming after the rather monumental Sisters changes, which saw spectacular points rises and then spectacular nerfs one after the other, where they probably wrote all those changes together. In terms of impact though, I'd guess that this one will largely stick more to points rather than rules updates, and probably save any really big updates for the next mission pack one, so probably not going to be overhauling 40K's main mechanics or anything like that, as seemed to happen last year for some reason. I'd guess that this one might well be a little bit more low-key. To take a look at things that they might address, maybe some of the more obvious things are faction balance in Warhammer 40k, the things that seem to be on top or the things that seem to be struggling, and in general relative to the vast majority of 40k's history. Game balance is still pretty good, the vast majority of armies in the sort of mid-tier sort of zone, and plenty of them have plenty of units that they can use and multiple viable detachments, certainly not all of them, but a good chunk. At the top end of the meta though, perhaps sticking their head above the parapet, the single most might be the Slanesh Demons. I feel like if you had to pick one army that has claim to fame as maybe 40k's strongest right now, it'd probably be them with the Legion of Excess. Chaos Demon win rates in general are around 56%, but Legion of Excess when taken alone is more like 66, even if that is going to have a bit more focus with the sort of sub-faction effect. Otherwise, for top placing armies, Ultramarines seem to be having disproportionate success at the top tables of tournaments, certainly one of the other scariest factions in the game right now. Necrons are still doing great, and primarily with Star Shatter Arsenal despite the nerfs to it, and maybe other armies with high win rates include the Imperial Knights, Custodes, Deathwatch Guard, Death Guard and Blood Angels. Most of those still seem to be on the upper end, and for specific detachments, the Imperial Guard Bridgehead Strike seems to be doing particularly well with around 60% wins. Finally, we've got 2 new codexes hitting 40k in a big way, with the Eldari and the Guard going tournament live kind of soon. The Eldari just had their first tournament weekend and had fairly well balanced win rates. They also seem to have done rather well at a whole bunch of different events. Definitely ones to watch there as people figure out their combos. And the Guard should have their codex points become the main official ones this week. So their new detachments, Beta Katakin, Rogue Dawn tank commanders, and all the rest will be tested in tournaments soon. And I think people are also expecting them to be pretty strong. Those ones seem kind of unlikely to get any major focus in a balance update coming soon though, given there won't be too much time for testing results and feedback after they drop. For those armies, it seems like the Chaos Demons might be most squarely in the crosshairs. As mentioned, Legion of Excess seems to be one of the single strongest armies in current 40k right now. Huge win rates of around about 66% or so, plus a massive amount of event wins relative to how many people play it. The main power feels like it just comes from enormous speed on the Slaanesh datasheets, and then pairing that with kind of ludicrous amounts of damage for how much they cost, provided they can be put in a way that they can afford to fight second, which often they can for Fiends of Slaanesh or Keepers of Secrets and things, provided they're not going into dedicated melee specialists, and even then they can still choose not to use the detachment rule and just fight normally if that makes more sense. I feel like the core rule is perhaps the biggest and strongest element of it. But the stratagems do have some nice supporting tricks as well, such as the one where they can bounce damage from one unit to another, and just keep one thing alive at all cost if that's what makes sense. I feel like if Games Workshop wanted to tone these down a bit, then probably rules changes to the Legion of Excess would probably be a better fix versus just increasing datasheet point cost. It doesn't seem like the Slaanesh demons are overpowered or anything in Demon Incursion. So just raising the points cost on all of those for all detachment maybe feels like it's probably the worst idea of the options. Maybe they could just slightly tone down the damage buff that you get for fighting second, maybe make it reroll ones to hit and wound as opposed to everything, or just go for reroll wound rolls but not the hit rolls or similar. I feel like some sort of change like those could still have it interesting and playable but not quite as tournament stomping. I certainly wouldn't be too surprised if lots of people pivoted back to the Demon Incursion if this did get nerfed in a big way though. It certainly felt like an interesting decision to give Demons a stratagem where they can 6-inch deep strike and still charge. Pretty well no faction in the game can do deep strike charges with quite that much reliability behind enemy lines. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop, Stronghold. They're a US based maker of magnetic carry cases to get your armies from A to B in safety. Magnetic cases being quite a popular trend in 40k in general, the idea being to attach little magnets to the bottoms of your miniatures' bases, attach them to magnetic surfaces, and then they don't slide around when they're in transit, so you can fit a whole bunch of miniatures all in one small space. Tabletop Stronghold's particular offering here are these mag cases. They're made of really quite sturdy and heavy duty MDF with a bunch of steel trays for the actual bits that you put your miniatures on. The trays can be slid in at a number of different levels depending on the height of the miniatures being stored. On the front of the cases they have a clear acrylic sheet, so pretty nice to be able to see your creations while they're being stored and transported and still have the nice paintwork on display. Broadly speaking, the vast majority of reviews of these have been really quite positive on Reddit and from people I've heard who've picked one up. Of course, there's plenty of other good makers of magnetic carry cases out there as well. They'll be linked down in the video description below. A big thank you to them for sponsoring the video, and I'll talk through a few of their options for case designs at the end of the video for those that are interested. Otherwise, talking about changes that might well affect the armies towards the top. Codex Space Marines, as ever, is a bit of an interesting case. I feel like from the tournament data and things, it feels like Ultramarines are a bit overpowered, if anything. With their boosted +1 to wound oath at the moment, and Guilliman double dipping on it. It seems they've racked up 20 odd tournament victories or 5-0 undefeated runs, which as best I can tell is around about double the amount of any other faction in 40k. That overall the actual Space Marine win rates are kind of well balanced at 50%, but I feel like that's hiding the fact that Ultramarines are doing significantly better than that, and the other chapters by comparison are doing less well. As a result, I also feel like Ultramarines are probably in the crosshairs for getting some points nerfs potentially. I feel like the single most likely character to get changes is probably Guilliman. If they don't change his abilities in some way, he'll probably go up in points further compared with what he is now. Just given that Ultramarines are quite so dominant over the other Space Marine chapters, they seem to be stomping a massive amount of tournaments, and it's really quite rare to see lists without Guilliman in them. If he does get nerfed in some way, then that will be a really direct nerf to Ultramarine power in particular. Calgar and Ventress are both still good datasheets, though they cost more than they did before. And then I'd maybe hope that if Ultramarines were toned down a touch, it might make a few more people look at the other Space Marine chapters like Imperial Fists or Salamanders, who still do have the really good selling point of +1 to wound oath a moment versus their Divergent chapter counterparts now. But their characters just add far less. I don't know if Games Workshop might need to do something else to help them out though. They did try a little bit by having certain characters make certain units higher objective control in the last update, which I think was a nice enough start. At least at the moment though, basically everyone's playing Ultramarines. I guess we also had that teaser that some sort of update for the Space Marines is in the works, sometime in summer to autumn most likely. We had the teaser of a Salamander picture. At this point we don't know whether it's going to be rules content for the Space Marines or model releases, but if it's some sort of supplement chapter rule system like they've had before in the past, this could potentially be another way to add a bit of draw to the more Codex compliant chapters. Regardless of whether or not they do anything drastic with internal Space Marine balance, I really wouldn't be too surprised if they patch out the sort of divergent but not divergent chapter army lists. The Blood Angels, Space Wolves and Black Templars and friends who are gaining access to boosted Oath of Moment from core Codex Space Marines. To me, this one maybe felt like a rules oversight from Games Workshop as opposed to something that was really intended. They basically said that armies could get the +1 to wound Oath of Moment if they didn't have any units with certain chapter keywords, such as Blood Angels, Death Watch and Black Templars, etc. Maybe forgetting that people could use their detachments and then not take their more divergent chapter units along, so say running Blood Angels with no Death Company or Sanguinary Guard, maybe going heavy on the Intercessors and Blade Guard and things. And that does seem to have been viable enough that a good few people have been doing it to some success at tournaments. It doesn't look like it's the dominant or only way to play. I'm sure some people enjoy it for the variety, but I still suspect that Games Workshop will probably patch it away given that it's not super popular. It seems like the boosted Oath of Moment change was supposed to help out the core codex as opposed to weird builds from the divergent chapters. And in general, I think Games Workshop tend to want to push the divergent chapters to have a good time using their fun units. They had a whole bunch of fun and theme on the board, so it would seem like an odd decision to have a big core Space Marine rule that basically gives you a massive reward if you leave all of your fancy unique toys and themed units on the shelf. For that reason, I really wouldn't be too surprised if this gets patched out in one of the next couple of balance updates. Otherwise, for armies that tend to be towards the top of the list, Necron's kind of already had a mini balance patch. The FAQ to the Grotmus detachments tones down Star Shatter Arsenal in a couple of ways, though it still seems to be their strongest detachment, at least in terms of performance. I've said this for a couple of updates, but I really wouldn't be too surprised if Doomsday Arcs go up in points at some point. They were being played plenty at 200 points, and now just seem to badly balance versus a bunch of other Necron firepower. They still seem to be in the position of strength where they could receive some other small nerfs, though don't really need anything absolutely massive. Otherwise, guard Bridgehead Strike. Otherwise, Knights aren't exactly stomping tournament tables. They often tend to be just really strong and more casual games, or doing better at smaller RTTs. Their win rates are rather high right now. It just felt like a really unexpected decision for them to drop the cost on Armiger Warglaves and Helverins when they did, given that they were already really quite good units before. The balance between Imperial and Chaos Knights doesn't seem great at the moment. Imperials winning significantly more than Chaos armies are currently, even with the boost to Chaos Knights that they got at the last update, including their core rule improving a bit. Looking at some armies potentially on the lower end of the power spectrum, here are some of the armies that are faring less well in current 40k. Imperial Agents are the most notable ones if Games Workshop even wants to bother trying to balance them as a full faction in the first place. In tournaments, they're near enough unplayed aside from a few people making them work as a board control army. It's not exactly the best feeling for a faction though, kind of similar to the Admech book when they released. And then otherwise the other really obvious one are the Sisters of Battle. Win rates are around about 41% after some rather brutal and unexpectedly harsh nerfs. For the most part though, most armies in Warhammer 40k are pretty solidly close to 50% win rates. For other ones on the very slightly lower end of the win rate curves at Grand Tournaments, Black Templars and Chaos Marines are both around about 45. Chaos Marines don't seem to have been doing too badly on the top tables with their creations of Bile and Renegade Raiders though. And otherwise maybe Tau, Dark Angels and Chaos Knights all seem a bit on the lower mid sort of side for the average player. None of those ones are really completely out of the running and are certainly strong enough to do great in casual games, but maybe could be ones that are deserving of small improvements or thoughts as to their internal balance in one way or another. If Games Workshop do actually want to make Imperial Agents into an army the same as the rest, they kind of desperately need some help at the moment though, and Games Workshop essentially didn't really touch them in the past couple of updates, despite kind of signalling that they did want to have them balanced as a mainstream faction, as they gave them a different set of points cost to their allied points, so seem to have created themselves the tools to make them into a good army if they want. In general, when they get played at the moment, it tends to be Imperialis fleet lists and usually doing board control objective scoring shenanigans, and some people have had success with them. There's one of those lists that won a grand tournament this week, but it still doesn't stop the army from overall having some big problems for most people who might want to put them on the board. In general for them, I feel like they need some rules changes rather than just points. I could really do with something that could help them take down tanks and monsters with some degree of reliability, which they just don't really have right now outside of some allied armigers or Imperial Knights. They've definitely got the rule space where they could help them out, probably by giving them a faction rule that actually works for them when they're on their own, as opposed to just their allied rule. It means they're basically the only army that don't get a core faction rule when you put them on the table. I can't help but think they could think of something that could help them out and make them more interesting, perhaps handing out some lethal hits, or even bringing back some sort of inquisitorial orbital strike that they've had in the past. That could be one way to help them out against heavy targets. There's definitely plenty of options though. They could mark things for some anti-keywords, or even do something like get some Imperial Knight datasheets a little bit cheaper to compensate for all the rules they lose when they're fielded outside of Imperial Knights. Feels like there's definitely options to make them function as a more normal army if Games Workshop want to. Otherwise, for the more mainstream factions, Sisters of Battle did seem to be as badly affected by the nerfs as people had suspected they might be. Win rates are around about 41%, basically no top tournament success and really rarely played at grand tournaments on top of that, and the nerfs did feel particularly painful given that Games Workshop gave them a pretty appropriate points update, toning them down so they were around about win rates 50%, but still pretty dangerous. And then my guess is that they wrote all the rules updates at the same time as they did the points, but just staggered out the rules updates. So essentially they just made the points updates make Sisters go from being maybe slightly overpowered to really quite well balanced, and then just hit the well balanced army with an absolute sledgehammer worth of nerfs, which tanked them down to weakest faction in the game pretty much. Their Miracle Dice generation was roughly halved, and that felt like maybe the single most painful thing. The Triumph of St. Catherine remained 250 points, but had its special rule toned down, so it's far less valuable with the generation of dice, and that was the reason that it was quite such a high points cost in the first place. Bringers of Flame in the best detachment got 5 separate nerfs all at once, and Castigators and Exorcists both went up, a fairly direct nerf to the faction power once again, given that they were both strong datasheets. The Miracle Dice nerf also hit the Grotmus Champions of Faith detachment, which really doesn't work so well without bonus Miracle Dice to burn, and that relegated it to being seen as dead in the water for most people. I feel like if they just wanted to pretty much undo most of the last balance updates, then it probably wouldn't be the worst outcome in the world. I feel like I'd certainly undo the Miracle Dice change that they made. It both made the faction much weaker and also less fun, and also made that Champions detachment borderline unplayable, so I'm not really too sure as to what the thinking was there. If they're going to keep the Triumph's abilities as it is, it should probably drop down massively from the 250 points, and I feel like with the Bringers of Flame being relegated to a really niche detachment now, they could probably afford to undo at least some of the nerfs to that. I'm not sure if they necessarily want to undo all of them, if they want it to be a bit more balanced against things like Hallowed Martyrs and the rest, but with the massive 5 different changes that they did, it seems to have basically taken it from best detachment down to one of the weaker ones. Hopefully they do something at least fairly drastic to help them out. There's certainly room for a solid power increase on their current performance. Otherwise, for possibilities, Black Templars also seem to be a bit behind the power curve. Again, this felt like they were kind of well balanced mid-tier, and then some balance updates sent them lower than that, increasing the cost of Hellbret's big Crusader squads, and Grimaldus felt like a bit of overkill to me really. I feel like they could either tone down or remove some of those changes and not cause problems. I guess they will have a codex coming out later in the year though. Dark Angels still seem to be an army that they're struggling to get right as well. They still remain the last Divergent chapter army, where the strongest attachment is generally considered to be ones from core Codex Space Marines. At the moment they tend to be using either Gladius or Stormlance. Previously it was all Gladius, but the removal of Fire Discipline seems to have made people take a second look at Stormlance, particularly in the context of a bunch of bike units getting buffs. In the last update, Games Workshop buffed Outriders, Black Knights, Samael, and the Company of Hunters detachment, and that does seem to have been enough to get Ravenwing being genuinely played in tournaments and doing alright. But the more general purpose Dark Angels detachments still seem to be super weak. The new Lion's Blade, the Unforgiven Task Force, and the Inner Circle Task Force all have win rates of around about 35% or less at grand tournaments and aren't played too much. Feels like all 3 detachments could just do with another round of improvements to try and have them competing against the core codex, and Dark Angels actually using their fluffy detachments. For Chaos Knights, with basically every single balance update since they came out back in 9th edition, War Dogs are still overpowered versus the big knights. Even if the Titanic Knights aren't exactly unplayable at a more casual level, you still see the vast majority of tournament armies either going super heavy on the War Dogs or literally pure War Dog spam, maybe with some allied demons. At this point it really doesn't feel like the Titanic Knights need that much more of a boost to have them genuinely compete. Perhaps another solid round of something like 20 odd point cuts on a bunch of the big ones might now be enough to tip the scales. It's just been very weird that in the last few updates, while they have had some small improvements to a bunch of the big knights, they seem to have been improving War Dogs by almost as much at the same time. The December one had a bunch of War Dog points dropped, and the Brigand and Stalker even dropped a couple of times in the one before that. Particularly with Chaos Knights maybe looking towards the lower end of the 40k power spectrum slightly at the moment, definitely feels like there's some room for some improvement for the big ones. Though that does seem to have been the case for a really long time, and I guess we're not too far off having Knight Codexes this year as well. For the Orcs, I feel like on the wish list for quite a long time has been some sort of improvement for the Speed Freak style army lists, with basically every one of their buggy datasheets being at least kind of underwhelming, and pretty well no one using the Cult of Speed detachment in any sort of army list that they really hope to do well with. It's a bit of a shame really, given that Speed Freaks are one of the cooler subgenres of Orcs, and they could give them a significantly better time either by boosting Cult of Speed or boosting the individual buggy datasheets. I feel like making the buggies perhaps a bit more dangerous in general would probably be the way that I'd go. Maybe just to make them maybe choices for other detachments and then have them still get really good with the buffs of Cult of Speed. Otherwise the Dreads and Killer Cans and things still don't really seem to be strong enough to form the core of a Dread Mob army list. It often tends to be infantry squads buffed by mechs, and a Big Hunt has had a bit of an improvement in a small rules boost last time around, but it doesn't really seem to have been enough to actually get people too interested to play it, perhaps partly with a lot of the thunder being stolen by the Big and Blood Axey Tactical Brigade. Just in general out there though, there's a massive amount of overshadowed detachments for various armies in the game. It does seem that with each balance update, Games Workshop seems to pick off a couple of these and try and give them some sort of improvement or reason to make their playstyle work more. Hopefully they continue to just give them small nudges in the right direction. It'd be really cool to see things like the Lost Brethren Death Company detachment for the Blood Angels being a bit better, or the Custodes Auric Champions character focus one be a serious contender versus say Shield Host, Talons and Solar Spearhead, or the rather unfortunately nerfed Tyranny's Unending Swarm make a great big termagant carpet on the board being more viable once again. It'll also be interesting to see if they actually decide to help out any of the Grotmas ones that were clearly undertuned when they came out, perhaps notably ones like the Votan one, the Eldari, Space Wolves, Black Templars, Imperial Agents and Thousand Sons. Basically all of those just really didn't compare well to their current armies, and probably missing some examples of ones that could also use help as well. But if they wanted to provide those with small nudges towards making them more viable, I think that would also be pretty cool. Otherwise, this one's probably not going to happen in 10th edition, but I still think it's maybe worth noting the units in 10th edition that Games Workshop just hasn't really bothered to balance at all, deliberately making flyers and fortifications anywhere between suboptimal to bad, and whenever one of the units winds up making a few niche appearances in a tournament list that's done well, immediately hitting that unit with some perhaps slightly disproportionate nerfs. In general, it just seems like they've got a sort of army archetype that they want you to build around in 40k, and maybe seeing flyers and fortifications just as not really very interactive, perhaps things like aircraft not being able to be engaged so well with armies that are almost entirely melee, or the problems that they can have with alpha strikes, or fortifications generally needing to have pretty massive damage and defense stats to compensate for not moving. It's maybe not too surprising that they're trying to keep them at least kind of niche in 40k, though I feel like you could probably still achieve making them fairly niche without having to have quite so many of them just being spectacularly ridiculously bad compared with most of the other things in the codexes. Say things like the Astra Militarum and Valkyrie being probably a good 50 odd points more than it really needs to be, or the Hammer 4 Bunker doing very little for its points costs. I feel like they're not averse to adding a little bit of complexity into 10th edition game design when it makes sense, and they could do something like that as well, maybe doing something like a hard cap of no more than one fortification to stop people spamming them, or having some sort of scaling points cost, where say your first flyer will cost this much, and then further ones after that will cost this much more. Just seems maybe a little bit lazy to keep things like cool aircraft like the Chaos Helldrake or various other models borderline unplayable, at least to a greater or lesser extent. Finally, this is probably kind of unlikely to happen on any one balance update, but at some point in the future it sounds like Games Workshop were going to have another look at points costs for Wargear coming back. In one of their Warhammer Plus design interviews showcase type things, they specifically talked about points cost and how that on reflection it might make sense for certain powerful bits of Wargear to have a points cost again, and that was something that they could potentially look at in the future. I think the things that they were talking about were things where the Wargear value is just vastly better for one bit versus another. Say for example a multi-melter as a heavy weapon versus maybe a heavy bolter. It means that in squads that can take them, basically everyone would take the multi-melter and not the heavy bolter. And they might consider some sort of limited scope of adding the points cost back for certain bits of Wargear, though it did sound like it was probably going to be more the exception as opposed to the rule. No idea if this one would happen at any time particularly soon, of course, though. It could just be a change that they have on the back burner back to reintroduce it in 11th edition maybe, or feel like if they were going to redo this in a big way, it might be more likely to turn up in a big sort of mission pack release, say alongside the Nachmund one if that one does come out in June, but it definitely felt like a fairly solid hint that some small Wargear points changes could come back in the future. From past discourse it feels like this one would be a fairly popular change if they did decide to, though I think that some people do like the simplicity and maybe the ease of balance that it gives them. Let me know your thoughts, hopes and fears for Warhammer 40K's next balance pass though whenever it turns up. What would you like to see to add fun flavour and alternative playstyles to the game in a better way? And what do you think that Games Workshop will do for the armies that are clearly at the top of the tree or struggling more? That's it for this one, though I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor for those interested, Tabletop Stronghold with their magnetic carry cases. They're linked down in the video description and shipped to a good portion of the world for free. And if you use their code AT25 in the video description, that gives 25% off their range. As mentioned, they have a bunch of steel trays to put your models on, and they stack up inside their cases. And this is roughly how many miniatures that you can fit on each tray, 90 odd bases of 25mm infantry, or around about 30 or so Terminators when fully loaded. For their case options, they've got three main sizes, a mini one for sort of more skirmish games. They can still fit some fairly big stuff in here. There's a Spartan and a Sakaran tank in here, plus a bunch of Terminators. This one's around £70 or $75 US. That's if you use the discount code. Shipping is free, but it might be exclusive of any VAT or sales tax. Their more standard size one is this regular mag case, which is about twice as tall. Quite a lot of room in this one for big stuff. You can see a full-size Chaos Knight on the bottom floor of it. Should be able to handle quite a lot of more normal-sized Warhammer 40K armies for transit. They come with a bunch of magnets included, and I'll leave the dimensions on the screen. Finally, they have the really big one, which is basically two of the above bolted together. The XL one is pretty enormous, should be big enough for the vast majority of collections, and I've got some different options depending on how many of the steel trays that you want. The ones with fewer are a fair bit cheaper. You can see the acrylic screen on the front for this one as well, so you can see models while they're being transported about. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description below if you want to take a closer look at their stuff. I'll leave this one here for now. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones each day. If you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel and want to support, the channel Patreon page is linked down in the video description. That has a few fun benefits such as entry to the monthly giveaways, plus seeing occasional videos early, and there's also all the 40k affiliate discount links as well. They're linked down in the video description and can save money on Warhammer around the world. A big thank you to any folks supporting via using those. In any case though, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.